in the Office of Career Services, and I want to welcome all of you here today to the Imagine Speaker Series program. This program was developed about 3 years ago to highlight alumni and their own career journeys and paths. It's often said by alumni that they never imagined how their lives and their careers would unfold as they kind of looked out after graduation into the future. So with that in mind, we decided to develop this program to bring alumni to campus so that they could tell us about the kinds of paths they took, the decisions they made, and things that happened that would take them in different directions. So with that in mind, we reached out to Sara to invite her to come to campus. Seeing her background as being very interesting and being one that many of you might be interested in learning more about. So let me tell you a little bit about Sara, and then she's going to fill in a lot of the details and give you a lot more of her insights and advice. Sara Judge McCalpin was the class of '82, and she was an East Asian Studies major. She graduated from Princeton and lived, worked, and studied in Beijing for several years. She returned to New York and continued to work in global consulting. She was director then of Asia for the AFS Intercultural Programs, and now serves as president of the director of the China Institute in America. She's also the founder of a consulting practice focused on China and has served as a trustee of Princeton in Asia, as well as several schools in the United States in various locations. So I'd invite you, Sara, to tell your story.
Great.
And she'll be available for networking and to answer some of your own questions after the event.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm actually going to sit here rather than, is that okay? No, I'm fine right here rather than, I don't really want to stand behind the podium. Thank you very much. So I graduated from Princeton with a degree in East Asian Studies in June of 1982. And 2 months later, I found myself flying to Beijing. August 28th, 1982. Dear Mom and Dad. Looking down at the countryside as I approach the Beijing airport, a topographical map below, and I'm reminded of Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Map. I'm listening to Bach on my Walkman. You guys may know what a Walkman is. And what was I doing listening to Bach? Temporarily in that netherworld between countries, between spaces. Time feels elastic with modern travel, doesn't it? In some ways, I'm wishing I could have taken a slow boat to China, to allow my mind and body to adjust to the cultural changes more gradually. Our first contact with China was at the CAC check-in desk. I was immediately struck by the somber, almost severe faces of the airline workers, not the graciousness and easy smiles of stewardesses I'm accustomed to. Ruddy faces, blue pants, white blouses buttoned to the neck, blunt chin-length hair, like models for a campaign poster. We waited for the plane in a large white room with high white walls and white plastic chairs like something out of a Woody Allen movie set. We were bussed out to the plane, all very orderly, with our boarding passes and passports checked at several points. The plane is a 707, not the circa 1940 prop plane I'd been told to expect. A relief, and yet I am calm. Thinking back on these last few days in Hong Kong, waiting to enter China, my head is buzzing. What did I expect? I can no longer remember. A vague and unfounded nervousness. Now I feel vital and full of energy and somehow more mature and peaceful, at peace. Will this change when the novelty of living in China wears off? I don't know. Sending much love to you, Sara. So I don't know about you all, if your parents keep your letters, but my parents kept every letter I ever wrote. Actually, you guys probably don't write letters anymore, emails. But my parents kept every letter that I've ever written to them, I think. And it's really been fun because I've been able to read through them. And it's helped me to piece together my impressions and early experiences in China 30 years ago. I love the name of this speaker series, Imagine. At 22, I couldn't imagine where life was going to take me. And my career path, if you can call it that, was circuitous and circular, not at all linear. I just knew that I loved China and I loved the Chinese language, and that's what I was excited about. So I set off for China, part of an exchange program to Beijing University. When I look back now, I remember so distinctly what it felt like to be a senior at Princeton, trying to figure out what to do next, where to go, what job to pursue. So I'm pulling back the lens and looking at the threads of my career and how they've woven together which I can only do in retrospect because at the time it didn't feel like a career path. It felt like a lot of disjointed decisions. Yet at each step, I felt I did what I felt was the right thing to do, what my heart told me to do. And I want to share with you some of what I learned along the way. So I was an East Asian Studies major here at Princeton with a concentration in Chinese, and I wrote my thesis on early childhood education in China. At the time when I graduated, there were only 3 of us in my third-year Chinese class, so there weren't very many people studying Chinese. But I knew I just wanted to get over there and to live there and to use the language every day and to have an adventure. I didn't think, oh, this is going to be good for my career or this is going to help me get a job. At the time, learning Chinese as an American was fairly rare. For me, living in China for 4 years was life-altering, and there were so many lessons that I learned from living in a foreign culture. The experience of being a minority, which was an incredibly important experience for me at 22. The experience at Beijing University of talking late into the evening with a group of friends from Mali and Gabon, speaking Chinese with these friends because that was the common language. All of them studying engineering and science and medicine on scholarships from the Chinese government. A realization that China took seriously its role as a leader of developing nations. The experience of watching the United States from halfway around the world. And out of that experience of living in China was born a deep respect for the culture and for the language. In thinking about my time in China in today's talk, I read through some of my journals, which I kept during the 4 years that I lived in Beijing. And reading through the passages I wrote evokes very strong images for me. I know I've shared these with my own children. And I can practically smell for those of you who've been to China or lived in China, smell the coal dust and that sharp smell of Chinese vinegar. So I thought I'd just share with you some of the passages, or at least one passage that I wrote about my impressions about the difference between friendships in the United States and friendships in China. June 20th, 1983. The meaning of friendship in China has unfolded for me slowly, frustratingly slow at times as I limp along with the language. Once developed, the commitment and fierce loyalty of friendship is unlike anything I've ever experienced in the United States. Untouched by political purges or the pervasive suspicion brought on by the Cultural Revolution, we take friendships more lightly in the United States. It does not take the same effort, buffered and softened as we are by modern conveniences. But in China, once trusted, and this trust is at the root, I believe, the loyalty between friends is intense, time-consuming, soul-enriching, involving deep gestures of generosity. So anyway, I won't bore you with more details from the journals, but it was such a fascinating experience. And again, I have about 6 of these journals that I kept when I was over there. And it's fun to go through and see what I was thinking and what I was writing about at the time. So at 22, I took off for China, and this is my first piece of advice for you. Do something unconventional. You have no idea how it will shape you, but it will. This is a time in your life to explore, have an adventure, pursue a passion, do what feels right. Don't opt for what seems right. Dig deep and do what feels right. I ended up going to China as a student, studying at Beijing for 6 months, and then staying and getting a job with an American company there. At that time, 1982, if you could speak the language and navigate the culture, you could get a job. I lived and worked in Beijing for the better part of 4 years, and the company I worked for was a consulting firm set up in 1980 by Ginny Kamsky, who was class of '74 here at Princeton. It was a fascinating and exciting time to live in China, so much rapid change. We did projects for General Electric and W.R. Grace and the New York Stock Exchange, and we did McKinsey's first project in China. This was before most U.S. companies had offices there, and I loved it. I loved the culture, the language, the history, the friendships, the learning. And I was working nonstop, exhausted, exhilarated, trying to drink it in. I first met Ginny Kamsky when I was a junior at Princeton. In fact, it wasn't at a career services event, but it was at the East Asian Studies, an East Asian Studies event, and she had come back. She had just opened her own company in China. In fact, it was J.P. Morgan Chase that she worked for first, and she opened the first office for Chase in China in 1978. And then she realized that her banking clients wanted her to do things other than just traditional banking. So she saw an opportunity, and she started her own company. It was one of the first American companies registered in China post-1949, and I think I was the 5th person hired. At that time, the company was comprised entirely of women, and we were all in our 20s and all unmarried. It was fun. It was an interesting experience. And as I said earlier, it was exhausting, and I was learning constantly. Ginny hired me and gave me as much responsibility as she thought I could handle, which was fabulous. So here's my second piece of advice. Seek out mentors, a professor, someone in the field who interests you, a Princeton alum. If you read about someone who's doing something interesting that you'd like to be doing, send them an email, give them a call. You'd be surprised how many people will be willing to talk to you and share their own experiences and wisdom. And this is really what Ginny Kamsky did for me. She was my biggest cheerleader, and it was great to have someone saying, you can do it, I know you can do it, I have confidence that you have the smarts and abilities to do it, stretch yourself. Having mentors is important in so many ways. Seek them out. So seek the advice of others, but in the end, abide by your own good counsel. Here I'll digress for just a moment and tell you a short tale about the importance of following your own counsel as well. A few years after graduating, my younger brother, who was class of '86 here at Princeton, received a phone call from one of his close friends and classmates. This friend had recently graduated from law school and had settled in Seattle and joined a law firm. Bruce, said his friend, I really could use your advice. Jeff is working on this crazy idea of selling books on the internet. He's working out of his parents' garage, and he wants me to consider leaving my job at the law firm and joining him. He apparently needs some legal advice. He's calling it something like Amazon. Oh, I don't know, my brother said. It sounds kind of risky to me. You just got your job at the law firm, and do you really want to give up that security? His friend decided to stay at the law firm, and the rest is history. So all of that is to say, don't always listen to what your friends tell you. Do keep your own counsel and trust your own instincts. That's what I did when I decided to leave China. 4 years into my time there, I literally woke up in the middle of the night and said to myself, time to leave. I had lived in China long enough so that I felt I was missing a beat with my own culture. I wasn't familiar with what was going on in the United States. Remember, this is the time before the internet. International phone calls were very difficult to make, and the fax machine had just been invented, I think. We used an old telex machine, this shows how old I am, in our office, which had like a ticker tape that went through, that you typed in and then fed through the machine. Very high tech. So I was worried that if I stayed in China much longer, I might stay forever. And in fact, I have friends who are still in China who were there when I was there in the early 80s who've stayed. And I missed the United States. I missed my family. I knew that I wanted to live back here. So I made plans to leave, and I ended up working for Kamsky Associates in their New York office for 2 years after returning from China, working on China market entry strategies for our clients and still traveling extensively back and forth. It was great to be in New York, though I found that the initial reentry wasn't easy. I imagine some of you in the audience speak Chinese. 我什么都不习惯. 吃的不习惯, 住的也不习惯, 什么都不习惯. So for those of you who don't, I'm just saying I wasn't accustomed to anything. What the food, the living conditions, everything was new. There were so many decisions to make on a daily basis. Living in China was so easy. There were so few decisions. One of the things I found that I missed the most was this wizened old Fuyuan in the doorway of the building. A Fuyuan is a service person, not really a doorman. That's too glamorous, but a little serviceman who sat in the doorway. And in those days, in 1982, they kept track of foreigners in Beijing. Every time I left my apartment, the Fuyuan would write down what time I was leaving. When I arrived with friends, they had to sign in, particularly if they were Chinese. And God forbid if the same Chinese friends would come and visit me, because then sometimes they would be hassled and questioned. And I found this little old man, this Fuyuan, incredibly infuriating. He was a real nuisance. And I really started to bristle at him spying on me. And yet when I moved back to the United States and into an apartment on East 80th Street in New York, I found that I missed that little man in the entryway who kept track of who I was with. I was completely anonymous, and that was one of the biggest culture shocks for me. It was in New York soon after moving back from China that I met my husband and got married, and soon thereafter realized that I needed a change. I was constantly traveling back and forth to China, which didn't seem very conducive to having a family. And so it was at that point that I decided to join the nonprofit world, and I hoped for a slightly slower pace. So I became Director of Asia for AFS Intercultural Programs, which is a high school exchange program. And this is a great opportunity for me to expand my interests and knowledge of Asia beyond just China. AFS had programs in Hong Kong and India, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Malaysia. It was a fascinating assignment to manage programs in so many different cultures. AFS was also the first place where I had some formal training in leadership. They had each of the directors enroll in a program on developing leadership skills, which was really important because we were managing programs in so many different countries and cultures. It was good to have a set of skills to apply to each of these complex management relationships. And this is another piece of advice. Take advantage of new learning opportunities throughout your career. For the past 2 summers, I've spent a week at Harvard Business School taking courses with other nonprofit leaders from around the world. And it's been fabulous learning. Almost as good as the education I received at Princeton, not quite. But it's really helped me develop new skills and a new network of colleagues who I now can rely on to trade ideas. After a few years at AFS, our first son, Will, was born. And I had a great setup, a very enlightened boss who was from Scandinavia and let me take a 6-month maternity leave, which was pretty unusual at the time. I think they're more enlightened in Denmark about work-life balance than they are here, or they were at that time in any event. I kept my position, and I was working 3 days a week in the city, traveling back and forth from Connecticut. And it wasn't easy. I was juggling work and babysitters and travel, but the part-time work really suited me at that time. Then I became pregnant with our second child, with Matt, and my husband took a job at the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, and we moved to Lake Forest, Illinois. And it was having an 18-month-old or an almost two-year-old and being pregnant with our second child that really put a bit of a hole in my career boat. And I don't mean to tell you guys that you're a hole. You're not. You weren't a hole. but I also just found that I loved parenting, and I loved parenting more than I loved my job. So here's another piece of advice. Follow your heart. For me, that meant stepping entirely out of my career for 12 years to raise 3 children. And it was the best years of my life, the hardest years probably. And I think for those of us who are educated at institutions like Princeton, there's a certain expectation that we have, quote, a big job. And I remember calling my dad on a very dark day in Chicago in the winter, about 3 months after leaving my job at AFS. And I found myself in a new community in north of Chicago in the middle of the winter with a 2-year-old and a newborn and a new identity, Mom. I was no longer working. And I remember saying to my father, what am I doing with my Princeton education? And he said, this is the best use of your Princeton education for you right now. And I think it was. Parenting is my favorite job, bar none. And I'm not encouraging you to opt out. I'm encouraging you to follow your heart and decide what works for you. For me, that meant leaving my career for a little while. And I knew myself well enough to know that I didn't think I could do both parenting and work at the same time and do them well. And a caveat here, of course, most women in the world don't have a choice. They have to work. Most mothers have to work. So I felt incredibly fortunate to have taken a bit of time off and to rely on my husband's salary to support us. So I tell you this because it generally isn't acceptable to say things like this in public. And I think we need to change that. And I think that women and men need to change that. and if they want to take time off and raise children, they should be able to do that. Every year, every 2 years actually, for the past 20, I spend a long weekend with my Princeton roommates. We go hiking, we explore cities, we have long wine-filled dinners of talk. We support each other, we cry, we laugh till tears fall down our faces, we dance to the music that we loved 30 years ago, which is very embarrassing. But these women are my pillars, they really are. They remind me of who I am. And each of us had very different careers and lives in the last few years. And the reason we got together actually was that one of my roommates 20 years ago lost her father. And at his memorial service, she had 2 men come up to her and say, "We were your dad's roommates in college." And she didn't know who they were. They had never been a part of their family life at all. They hadn't been a part of her life. And so she called all of us up and said, "We're going to change this. We're going to get together." And so we really do it every 2 years. One is an attorney, one is an artist, one is an investment banker. Some decided to take 2 weeks off with the birth of each child and then return to work. Some of us decided to step out of our careers for a while. But each of us did what felt right. So another note of advice, keep in touch with your friends from Princeton, because make the time. It just enriches you. And these friendships were the best ever. After 12 years of being at home, I was given the opportunity to opt back in. And now I would say I have my dream job. I love what I do. And I didn't opt out entirely during those 12 years. I took an occasional Chinese class to keep up my language skills. I did some short-term consulting for China Online and the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And I kept in touch with the people whom I had worked with previously. And this is also important, too. If you do decide to opt out for a few years, keep in touch. Keep yourself current. Keep yourself relevant. When our daughter, Haley, who was born also when we were in Chicago, in the Chicago area, was in 3rd grade, I decided to start my own consulting firm with a focus on China. And after setting up this one-woman LLC, probably makes my children laugh because they don't even know that I have a company, probably. It was just me. I contacted as many people as I could who I was still in touch with, who had interests in China, including Ginny Kamsky, whom I mentioned earlier, who had given me my first job in China. I really hadn't been in touch with her for about 15 years, but I did contact her, and I told her I was looking for the next challenge. Ginny had just become the chair of the board of China Institute, and she asked me whether I could help to expand their corporate programs. So that's how I got my foot in the door with a 2-day-a-week, 10-week consulting project at China Institute. I did a number of short-term projects, actually, and they helped to raise the profile of the organization and to raise funds. And when my predecessor left the Institute, quite suddenly, the former president, Ginny and the Board of Trustees asked me if I would step in as acting president for 4 months, which soon turned into becoming the full-time president. So working hard and proving myself on a few projects and being in the right place at the right time and having a long-term mentor and a good dose of luck helped me to land this current job. And I feel incredibly fortunate because I was at home with my children when they were young and then found a deeply satisfying job that combines my interests in China and in education. A little bit about China Institute. China Institute was founded in 1926 by John Dewey and Hu Shi. Hu Shi was the president of Beijing University, ambassador to the United States, and then, little known fact, he was a librarian at the guest library here post-1949 for about a year. John Dewey had traveled to China in the early 1920s and found that he met students all over China who spoke beautiful English and who knew a lot about the United States, and yet his students back at Columbia spoke no Chinese and knew nothing about China. So he founded China Institute along with Hu Shi and a number of other scholars. And for 85 years, we've pursued the same mission that John Dewey and Hu Shi set out for us, which is teaching Americans about China. We do it through programs in business and education and culture and art. We teach Chinese, we train Chinese language teachers, we train K through 12 history teachers. We have a gallery of Chinese art, lectures on China, and a burgeoning corporate education program. Our mission was relevant in 1926. It's even more relevant in 2011 because the U.S.-China relationship is, in my opinion, the most important relationship of the 21st century. And I'm still growing, and I'm still learning. We're on the cusp of buying a new building for China Institute in New York, and I guess I'm saying that on film. I hope it comes true. And so I'm learning all about New York real estate, and that's fun because it's a new skill and something new that I've never done before. So inevitably, these sorts of talks include forms of advice, and I've given you a little bit of that already. But here's a recap. First of all, get out of your comfort zone. Stretch yourself. Do things you aren't necessarily comfortable with. What excites you? You know, working in a refugee camp in Thailand or going to China, you know, do it. Joining a bank training program, great, do it. But maybe you can go to Rio instead of doing it in New York. I pushed outside my comfort zone in so many ways when I became president of China Institute. Prior to my job, in fact, I was petrified of speaking in public. It just absolutely, I broke out in a cold sweat, stomach butterflies, the whole thing. And now I have to speak in public all the time, and I found that that's one of those skills that I just had to stretch myself and learn how to do it. Secondly, follow your heart and do what feels right. I did this 30 years ago when I graduated, and I took off for China because it felt right. It felt like the right thing to do. I did it again when I was 32, and I left my career for 12 years to raise 3 children. It felt like the right thing to do. And finally, when I decided the time was right for returning to work, I followed my heart. It really felt right. Thirdly, find mentor or mentors, people who can encourage you and help you, who can act as a sounding board, someone who can provide counsel to you when you're making decisions about your career. It's incredibly helpful. And again, I think you'll find if you reach out to people, often they're really willing to talk to you about their own career choices and to help you with yours. The fourth piece of advice I give you is to be authentic and to live with integrity, to be integrity. Certainly in leading an organization, this has been the most important quality for me, to project to those around me. Right, wrong, black, white. Sometimes decisions aren't as delineated as this, but often for the big decisions, there's clearly a right path. Be integrity. And as you move into leadership positions, people watch you. They take note. I actually have a quick story to tell on this front about being authentic. 6 years ago, when I joined China Institute as acting president, as I said, I was asked to take it on for 4 months while they were doing a search for a new president. And I just said I could do it till the end of the school year, until my kids got out of school. After 6 weeks, I found that I loved the job. I loved what I was doing. I was completely taken by it. And luckily, the board asked me if I would stay on. And when the board asked me, I decided that I needed to be entirely truthful with them about my aspirations and priorities. And I did something that I thought at the time might have been career suicide, which is I told them quite clearly that family is my priority. I said I would give 500% of my time to the Institute during working hours, but that in the end, my family was my priority. Remarkably, they hired me anyway. And I had been very clear from the get-go what my intentions and boundaries were. And since then, several trustees have actually told me that they respected me more for being so clear about it. And they were more sure of their desire to hire me. And finally, I want to encourage you to do what Facebook, the chief operating officer of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, told Barnard's graduating class to do last May. And she told them to lean in. Just lean into whatever you set your mind to. Don't let people tell you you can't, or you're not old enough, or you don't have the experience or the graduate degree. Just lean in and surround yourself with those people who will say, you can do it, and I'll help you figure it out. And come back to me for advice when you reach the next threshold. So there's a brief synopsis of my career so far, and I feel like I still have another number of years to go. As I said earlier, even now, I don't really think of it as a path. I think of it as intersecting circles, pursuing what I felt in my heart was the right thing to do. I was lucky to have chosen to study Chinese and China 30 years ago, and it may have been prescient, but it wasn't planned. I didn't think to myself, oh, this is going to help me in my career. I did it because I loved the language and the history and the culture. So that's my final piece of advice to you. Do what you love. So that's it. Thank you. So I'll take questions if there are any questions, if anyone has any questions. Any questions?
I'm just curious to know more about what it was like living in China at that time. That must have been incredible. All your journal entries. And, I mean, what are you doing with that right now? Do you have a
Actually, Matt.
putting these things into? Like,
Yeah.
Are you writing a book?
So here's the first one. I mean, literally, and it's funny that you asked this because my sons are both in the audience here, but Matt and I have been emailing back and forth because he's taking a class on modern Chinese thought, and I've actually been emailing him bits and pieces from my journal. And I'm not doing anything with it right now. I hope to, turn it into a book at some point, but it was a fascinating time, and I only realized in retrospect how unusual and pioneering it was. At the time, it just felt like the right thing to do because I wanted to be over there. But such a different world from the way that it is now, and China has changed immeasurably. And I go back to the neighborhood where I lived out near Beida, and you can't even recognize there's been so much building. And the thing that I really noticed between the time when I lived there in the early 80s and then I didn't go back again until 2005, is that right? I was there in 90, when were you born? Well, 90. I was there in 1989, right after the Tiananmen incident. In fact, I was pregnant with Will at the time. And then between 1989 and 2005, I didn't go back. And the thing that really amazed me when I went back was the energy level. Well, first of all, people weren't wearing Mao suits anymore. And there were cars on the roads rather than bicycles. And there, when I was living there, there were a lot of horse carts and that's what I heard outside my window were horse carts and roosters and things like that. But the energy was so different. The energy that where people walked, they were more upright. I mean, it was as though there's this feeling of incredible hope and optimism. And I described that a little bit in that first letter to my parents. It felt very somber in 1982. So I don't know. Maybe someday, if I have time, I'm going to put it all together. I've got 6 of these, so at some point, yeah.
Some people say that to face challenges and to go forth and pursue your dreams is the ultimate goal and the ultimate way to truly take from life the most enjoyment you can. Could you mention a time in your life, perhaps during the course of these events, where you faced a setback, something unexpected or something that threw a curveball? Because I suppose they say that what we do in times of happiness is wonderful to know and helps us learn and move forward. But what we do in times of hardships really speaks to our character. And how have you faced a challenge, and how have you found ways to overcome it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. The period of time that I described when we moved to Lake Forest and I left work was probably one of the most challenging periods of my life, and partly because I had really shaped my identity as a working person, and then I was a mom. It was very, very different. And I think that was probably the most difficult 6 months at least of the last well, it was probably six months of my life, because I didn't have any friends, and I had a lovely newborn, and a 2-year-old, and a new community, and I didn't know anybody, and I didn't have a job, and I thought, you know, I was exhausted from small children. So that's one. And I don't know. I'm trying to think of other setbacks. No, you guys aren't going to help me out, huh? Yeah, but anyway, yeah, that's probably the toughest time, I would say, was during the 6 months when I left work. Yeah, yeah.
I think it would be a very different experience for Americans living abroad now with the connection of the internet, and that they would feel probably not as out of beat with America, that would change their path. Do you think?
That it would change their path? Yeah, it might change the experience. It's a really good question, because I mean, again, I couldn't call home. I got letters. There was no internet. So I was there. You know, when I wanted to get together with, I actually befriended a wonderful a professor at Beida, at Beijing University, who had gotten his PhD here in 1939 in politics. So he had a PhD from Princeton in politics, which during the Cultural Revolution did not bode well. He was sent to raise pigs for 10 years in the countryside in Gansu. Wonderful gentleman who spoke English right out of the 1930s. He was really terrific. But I had to write letters to him. You know, he didn't have a phone. So I would write him a letter and say, you know, dear Professor Wu, let's get together. And he would write me back and say, in 10 days, meet me on the corner, right? With your bike, and we'll go to my daughter's house to have lunch on Sunday afternoon. It took that much time, right? So yes, I think it would be, I know it's very different now, because there isn't that same isolation. You know, the other thing during that time in the early 1980s was there were still these campaigns going on in China. They were post-Cultural Revolution. I can see you nodding your head. You must know a lot about that period of time. And I wrote my thesis on the Simei Wujiang movement and how it affected early childhood education in China. There's 4 Graces and the 5 Beauties, which was this campaign to try to make kids more polite, essentially, because during the Cultural Revolution, all manners were kind of thrown out the door. But there was also the spiritual pollution campaign during the time that I was there, which was essentially anti-Western, anti-American. We were the spiritual pollution. So it was a very isolated and fascinating time to be living over there. Yeah. Is there any other questions? Yeah.
How do you view today's China, just to be frank?
Yeah.
Like, I think it's quite different from like 20 years ago.
Oh,
and
yeah.
also, it's getting to a point, my feeling, it's getting to a point that people are not as optimistic or happy anymore. Like the
Yeah.
conflict in the society between the people and the government is going to reach to a point and just like wait for the economy to collapse and just I think there will be a lot of opportunities there, but just like big picture wise and how to participate in a constructive way.
Yeah, how should we participate in a constructive way? Or, I mean, I would agree with you. I think that what I talked about being back there in 2004, 2005, and the optimism, I think now there is a sense of, when I go back, there is a sense of the dichotomy, strong dichotomy, economic dichotomy now between those who have and those who don't. I mean, one of the things about communism was that, there wasn't as much of a difference between the very rich and the poor. And I think you're right. I think that has changed somewhat in China, that there isn't quite as much of the optimism. And there are issues, huge social issues that they're dealing with. And they're dealing with pollution and with water shortages and all sorts of things. And I don't know if I've answered your question or if it was a question, except that I agree with you. I think it's changed.
more specific
Mm.
one or ideal or hope?
Yeah, well, I mean, it informs the work that I do, right? At China Institute, the reason that we do the work that we do is to improve the relationship between China and the United States. So that's my hope, is that that relationship will continue to be peaceful. And we think that through building a bridge of cultural understanding and in helping Americans to understand China, that it helps to ensure that peaceful relations. So, yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about advertising campaigns in China, and meeting there when there were all these kind of public mobilization campaigns led by the government, like a propaganda almost spin.
Right.
I'm really curious, and now that you do work about helping foreign countries get into China,
Right.
people, distribution channels for ads, et cetera.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you do, but I'm really curious
Not anymore,
to know,
but
like, what kind of change you've seen in the way that you can reach the public. Like, what now has been informed by historical campaigns or?
Oh, informed by historical, yeah. Right, because back then, the you know, campaigns, the characters were just written on walls, right, all over the place. I mean, and you know, so that was the way that that certainly they were communicated, and through loudspeakers, right? I mean, when I was at Beijing University, I ran every morning around Weiminghu, the no-name lake, and in the morning I would listen to the news, basically propaganda, as I was running around. That was when I first heard the news that we had invaded Grenada, in 1984, I'm going to say. And you know, and I heard it first from a communist Chinese kind of point of view over these loudspeakers as I'm running around the lake. You know, that was then. Now, the internet, absolutely the internet. And it was interesting. Yesterday morning at China Institute, we had a speaker, the head of China's Sovereign Wealth Fund, came to speak at China Institute, and he was talking about the fact that. That even China's leadership is reading blogs, you know, that they are informed by blogs, which is fascinating to me. He's also talked with me about having to explain to China's leadership about the economic crisis, because that's kind of his job too, to explain American economics to leadership. But he said that they're reading, that's, you know, part of their required reading now, are some of these blogs that have millions of people reading them. So I would say the internet is the way that people are reached. And you know, tweeting, right? I mean, what do they call it? 微博, 谢谢. Oh, yeah, 对, 微博. Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what's the strongest impression about Chinese personality and characteristics during your stay or the later contact with Chinese people?
Oh, my strongest, well, as you know, you heard me talking about friendship.
Yeah, besides that.
That was it for me.
Okay.
It was the friendship, you know.
Okay.
There was just this deep, abiding trust that seemed to.
So it seems that you are very enjoying that.
I loved it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you
I loved
still
it.
keep some friends, like old friends in China?
You know, I have a few that I keep up with when I go back over, but several of my friends are actually now here in the United
Okay.
States. Yeah, yeah. So, anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned you did like consulting, and
Yeah.
then like I always hear about consulting, but I think it's kind of like a simple question.
Yeah.
I know what it is, but exactly what
Yeah.
it is.
Good
and,
question.
Like, maybe if you can use like a specific project and skill.
Absolutely, yeah. So the consulting work that I did was for a very small consulting firm that was specialized, but that did what we used to call back then kind of soup to nuts consulting. So that, for instance, I did a lot of work for General Electric at the time, and for the GE lighting group, and they would bring over, they wanted to sell high pressure sodium light bulb technology. I never knew I could describe the inside of a high pressure light bulb in Chinese. Very obscure skill, but they wanted to bring that technology to China. So we would help them to identify a factory well, it took them to 5 or 6 different factories. They would then decide which factory was the one they wanted to work with. Back then, you had to go through the ministry. You know, you couldn't do it in any direct company-to-company projects. You had to go through the ministry. So I traveled around China with this group from GE. We looked at factories. We then helped them to negotiate technology transfer agreement. And then Jack Welch, who you all may not know who he was, but he was the president of GE years ago, decided they weren't going to invest in China in 1985, and that closed the door. So the whole 18 months that I spent on that project was just down the drain. But anyway, it was his loss, I'm sure, because I think GE had actually invested in those light bulb factories. They probably would have been doing pretty well at this point. So it was helping them to understand different factories, make a decision about where to invest, and then actually help them with understanding China's legal code and negotiating the contract. So, yeah.
Based on
Yeah.
now speaking the language that you
Yeah.
spoke to, it's really exciting to see that Chinese is still so important, especially in the U.S.-China relations.
Right.
Now, how would you say is the need for Chinese American linguists?
Yeah.
How has that evolved in time? What would you say is the role now of Americans who are interested in Chinese, or
Right.
what sort of jobs are the biggest callers for?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I work now in a nonprofit. You know, I see, I certainly see the interest in Chinese language, because we train a lot of Chinese language teachers, and we start teaching Chinese to kids who are 3 years old at China Institute. So obviously, I think that it's really important to be able to speak the language. I also think it's the most beautiful language in the world, but that's my bias. And I think there are lots of different opportunities. I think that, you know, whether it's schools or nonprofits or companies that want to have people who can speak the language and navigate the culture. Okay. Is there anything else? Well, I'm happy if any of you want to talk one-on-one, I'm happy to, I'll be here. So thank you all very much.